Today we're going to hear from 4 scholars on topics that chip away at the behemoth of questions concerning the impact of the cyber domain to both national and international security. Our first speaker received his PhD from Edith Cowan University with an emphasis on information operations and cybersecurity. He is a retired naval officer and now serves as president of the Peregrine Technical Solutions and as editor of the Journal of Information Warfare. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lee Armistead.
Thank you very much for that introduction. So we're going to start off a little bit and talk about the journal because if you're an academic, if you're interested in writing and researching about cyber warfare and information warfare, this could be a great option for you. This journal is produced 4 times a year. It's a double-blind, peer-reviewed journal. And then once a year, we have a special edition where we collaborate with NSA. I do have a couple copies of that particular edition that we just published last summer available. We are the only organization that NSA collaborates from an academic aspect with regard to cyber. And we've been doing it for the last 2 years. We have another edition that we're going to be working through for next year as well. Also, I want to talk, if you heard Senator Warner's speech yesterday, he was talking about cyber education, cyber training. We are the first company in the Commonwealth of Virginia to have a cyber apprenticeship approved. So we're part of that solution that you're looking for in trying to develop and mentor cyber personnel, help with the DoD and federal work. So this paper is really, as a colleague mentioned, it's research. It's the start of a discussion. It's an attempt to try to determine how you can accurately measure cyber power. But more importantly, what kind of metrics, what kind of measures would you use to determine success? Right now, there's many established methods of measuring power, but in most cases they go to what we consider traditional power, military, economic, diplomatic way. But information or informational power is very different. It cuts across all domains, and it cuts across many different categories. When you look at traditional methods of measuring military power, you count tanks, you count aircraft, you count battalions of men. But you can't do that with information. And so trying to determine how powerful a group is or from an information or cyber aspect is very difficult. So what this research has done, as is shown here, is to try to look at some different methodologies. One was a top-down methodology where you try to organize and have a coherent strategy. And the other was more of a bottom-up or decentralized methodology where you tried to look at just simply utilizing what assets were available. So once again, I'm going to do a brief overview of the paper, and then I'm hoping after we all present, we can have a group discussion and come up with some ideas of how to best measure information power and also how to best measure success when you're conducting an information operations or when you're conducting a cyber effort. As many of you in this room know, you've been living this, you've been operating in this world. The last 2 or 3 decades has radically changed how we look at information and information power. And so it's been a transformational aspect. And the one thing you take away from this is traditionally military, diplomatic, and economic power is managed by a governmental organization. The government has armies, they have navies, they have air force. The same thing with economic power and grants and so forth. And diplomatic power is always with like a Department of State or something like that. There is no Department of Information. There is no one federal agency that basically controls or coordinates the information. And yet, if any of you know the late Dr. Dan Keel from NDU, he had an acronym that he used called DIME, Diplomatic, Information, Military, and Economic. And that was the 4 elements of power. So who does control information or informational power? And we all know it's decentralized because every group has a portion of that. The other thing that's interesting to think about too is when you look at power is that if you traditionally look at the government having military power, economic power, when it comes to information, that's been devolved down to the masses. Everybody in this room has informational power with you. Everybody has a phone. You have access to all the information you could ever ask for through that smartphone. So when you look at informational power, if you will, it has been transferred down to the masses, and no government, no organization can rightly say, we control it. So that's what's different, that's what's happened in the last 2 or 3 decades. So we're trying to look at analyzing current practices and how you measure power with regards to cyber. And we're also trying to look at how one determines the ability to conduct power. One of the things that's interesting is that when you look at power, there are nations that have power. There are organizations that have power. But the ability or the willingness to use that power is key. And one of the things we came out with from this research is down there at the very bottom is that power is really about those that would want to use this power. They want to be influential in this domain. And it's about perception. It's an ephemeral concept. So if you're out there and you're saying you're going to use cyber power, you're willing to use cyber power, you're out there demonstrating it, then in fact you may have more cyber power than another organization who has greater capabilities but is not willing to use it or not willing to demonstrate that. The guest speaker yesterday, Mr. Sean Henry, talked about attribution. He talked about intelligence. He talked about trying to determine what your adversary's capabilities were. And once again, this same applies here as well, in trying to determine how much somebody's actually willing to use the power they have. I think most people do understand what power is. There's an old definition that says power is the ability of A to get B to do something that B would not normally do. And so, but actually how you use it, how you take information and make somebody do or not do something is very important. Yesterday, one of our speakers talked about North Korea. They talked about attribution with Sony. That was a huge moment for the United States, where the NSA came out and used their tools and their capabilities, and they showed how the North Koreans hacked Sony pictures. That was key because, once again, it's showing people that we know and we can see what they're doing. And so attribution is key. And once again, when it's power and measuring it, the ability to see and understand what people are doing and how they're doing it is key moving forward. One of the problems that we saw in this research was a lot of times when you try to measure power, you try to do it at the nation-state level. But as we all know, it's not nation-states and it's not groups of that magnitude that are often doing what we call cyber attacks. It can be smaller groups, it can be commercial groups, it can be hackers, it can be criminals, and so forth. So when it was doing this research, we looked at some studies that talked about measuring the cyber power of an organization. There was a study by Rand that talked about a number of different levels of measuring cyber power and trying to develop capabilities. The problem with that study, and one of the problems with many other studies like that, is it only becomes a power when you convert it, when you take that informational resource and then you convert it and try to conduct an action. Excuse me. So the other study we looked at was also with Booz Allen. Booz Allen did a study with economists where they were basically trying to mention and trying to lock down a number of countries. And Booz Allen looked at 39 different indicators across 19 countries, including legal framework, economic and social context, technology infrastructure, and industry. And once again, they did rank these 39 indicators in 19 countries, but it was all countries. And we all know there's so many different actors besides countries that have cyber power. Likewise, if you're familiar with Dr. Sam Lyles out of Purdue, he did a study of 14 different nations where he tried to analyze power. But once again, it was at the nation-state level. And so there's a gap out there. There's a gap of who's actually conducting cyber as how we can actually measure it. And that's what part of this paper is trying to accomplish. There's also a gap of how you actually define success. Many people are familiar with the bombing campaigns that were done by the Allies in World War II, as well as the bombing campaign done by the U.S. Air Force and U.S. Navy in Vietnam. And after those conflicts, the Department of Defense went out and did these huge bombing surveys, long series of analysis. And they were trying to confirm how effective these bombing campaigns were and their measures of effectiveness. And some of the conclusions that came out were that, especially in Vietnam, they weren't nearly as effective as they had hoped to be. Kosovo is another good example, more recent. Kosovo, basically, they were bombing for 54 days before they decided to start using some sort of information warfare and information tactics to take down Milosevic and his cronies. So once again, if you're doing bombing, you're going to bomb till the rubble bounces. But we all know that cyber can be very effective if used correctly. So part of this paper was trying to look at what is considered a successful cyber operation. What are your measures of success? What helps you determine if you were effective or not effective. And from a power aspect, did you make B do something that B would not normally do? When you're looking at metrics, metrics is tough. Everybody wants to have metrics about what is considered a successful information operation or what is not. And a lot of times you're trying to basically measure a negative. If you want somebody to not do something, what is the measures for that? What can you determine what actually made them influencing to not do something? If you're familiar with electronic warfare, where we would use suppression enemy and air defenses, missiles to take out radars and so forth. But now you can do the same type of effects with a cyber attack. And once again, it's very tough to measure what exactly was the key component and made that mission a success. So a lot of the research we did, and a lot of people I was interviewing while I was doing this research, wanted a top-down approach. They wanted to have a standardized set of tools. They wanted to have a comprehensive strategy. They wanted to be all done in a global fashion, looking down and be coordinated. The problem with the research and the problem with some of that ability to do that is, as you saw today, there's so many different actors out there that are actually conducting cyber efforts. And once again, a lot of the key speakers that we talked about are not in the federal government. They're not military players. You had Amazon talking today. Amazon is basically doing cloud services for many of the different federal agencies, and they are not a federal player. They're not going to be part of a comprehensive strategy. So what we thought was, while the top-down strategy may be what people really want to see, in effect, what's happening today is a bottom-up strategy. A bottom-up strategy where you're using the assets at hand. You are using the devices that you have, and you're trying to basically take the tools that are available and conduct operations in that manner. What's also interesting about this research was that it's not just the federal government. In fact, the federal government has started to play a more minor role as other organizations, whether it's NGOs, non-state actors, commercial organizations, are stepping up to the plate and not only conducting cyber operations, whether they're offensive or defensive, but also going in and trying to protect themselves and their assets. You had many speakers. The speaker from NATO here just talked about all the different incidents that have happened. To kind of round this out and kind of ramp down to the next speaker, we still have a hard time defining what is a cyber act of war. We also still have a hard time defining what is a proper retaliatory effort. So we're going to continue this research, and I'd love to have a discussion once we get done talking about what the audience thinks are good ways to measure cyber power, good ways to measure success of operations, what kind of tools, how they can collaborate, and then also how they can also use this to conduct efficient cyber operations in the future. Thank you very much.
So right now, actually, we'll take a couple specific questions just for this paper. There's a lot of disjointedness otherwise. So if there's any distinct questions relating to the measuring of cyber power, please.
Right behind you.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Jennifer Talley, and I'm the social science professor, I guess, in cybersecurity. And one of the things that I find interesting in the field of cyber is that we talk about concepts like power. And really, power tends to be more of a psychological made-up construct and very hard to agree on. And so while we are measuring objective reality, or what we think is objective reality, the number of machines hacked, how much information they have and how they can use it to exploit their adversary, it's hard to discern how much of that actually equals power and not. So it's almost like a continuum of low power to high, and what objective facts sort of bubble up and comprise a perception of power. And in cyber, I find a lot of these big abstract concepts like security, power, effectiveness, they're very hard to define because we don't always agree on what objective data we need in order to make a judgment on how much power is there, how much effectiveness is there, how much of that equals mission success. I'm just curious if you've ever come across more of a psychometric approach on looking at those very abstract terms and how people perceive and define them inherently, and then figuring out what measures map to that.
Good question. There's a series of cyber academic conferences I'm affiliated with, and we have discussions like that all the time. And I think one of the things we've learned in the cyber academic community is there's a huge need for an overall taxonomy and an ontology, because we all have different definitions. Some people talk about cybersecurity, other people talk about information assurance. Are they the same thing? People use information warfare and cyber operations almost synonymously, and other people say there's rigid definitions. So to answer your question, I think what we need to keep doing is trying to develop a common language that we all can understand, and that might help us to understand power. What is cyber power? And then also, I think from my research, a lot of times somebody can have more cyber power just because they are saying they have cyber power, or they are willing to use it. 20 years ago, people were trying to relate cyber power to nuclear weapons, and they wanted to try to use that regime, but we quickly realized that many people are willing to use cyber power. Well, nobody wants to use nuclear weapons, so that was not a good analogy to go forward. So I hear what you say, and I agree with you that we need to come together as a group and put down some language that everybody can understand. Any other questions? Okay.
Actually, we do have one. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Ihab Khalifa. I work for Future Center for Advanced Research and Studies. Actually, if we can't measure cyber power by depending on offensive and defensive capabilities and how many targets in the state can be vulnerable for cyber attack, how we can measure deterrence in cyberspace? If it's clear to achieve deterrence in the traditional domains like sea, land, and air, how we can achieve and measure deterrence in cyberspace?
It's a good question, and I think once again, I've heard people try to measure cyber power around nodes and around capabilities from a network aspect. The ability to measure cyber deterrence, I think, for a lot of CIOs and CISOs is kind of ephemeral, if you will, because it's not like you know who your attacker is. I know Mr. Henry talked about using intelligence and trying to determine, but I was talking to Goldman Sachs, and Goldman Sachs has a whole unit that's trying to determine who's going to attack them. And there's so many different people that can attack you. So my question would be, if you don't know who your attacker is, the only thing you can really do is strengthen your network as much as you can. And you can try to do it the old CIA way, trying to work users, technology, and policy. And I think that's what most people are doing. Now, there were some great speeches yesterday saying that we have to move beyond that. We have to be automated. Humans can't do it fast enough. And I agree with everything the speaker was talking about. So I think you can measure how secure you are. But once again, if you're still going to get hacked or attacked, that only can go so far. So, but I'd like to talk to you after we get done about this as well. Thank you.
Our next speaker obtained her bachelor's in science, in computer science and engineering, and her master's in artificial intelligence and intelligent systems. She is currently doing her multidisciplinary PhD thesis in cyber operations and cybersecurity at the Faculty of Technology, Policy and Management at Delft University of Technology and the Faculty of Military Sciences from Netherlands Defense Academy in TNO in the Netherlands. Please join me in welcoming Clara Mathouse.
Thank you for your nice introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank you for selecting my article and inviting me here today to give this presentation. We've tried to design and develop a framework, a multidisciplinary framework that is trying to profile and define cyber weapons from a multidisciplinary perspective by considering a technical approach, military approach, and a legal approach. In the last years, several events have been considered cyber warfare or events of cyber weapon use, but we are still not able to understand how they can impact our lives, what kind of implications and consequences they can have on our lives and our society. First of all, we should be able to understand what do they mean, how do they look, and how they can be treated in order to assess their impact in our lives and our society. We are doing this by first presenting the context of use of cyber weapons. If you want to understand what something means, we have to understand first the environment that they are practically designed, developed, and used. We are proposing a multidisciplinary definition. We are presenting a mechanism of profiling them by designing characteristics and classification criteria, and we will evaluate our framework in two perspectives. The first perspective is by designing a profiling matrix for 3 cyber weapons. The first one is Stuxnet, of course, that targeted Iran. The second one is Operation Orchard, that targeted Syria. And the third one is Black Energy 3, that targeted Ukraine. We have also conducted a multidisciplinary exploratory case study around Stuxnet, and we have concluded that this framework is effective in assessing and profiling cyber weapons that were practically designed and used in 3 different moments of time, in 2007, 2010, and 2015, and they can be a very good basis in order to assess and predict their effects in cyber operations and cyber warfare. In the last 10,000 years, we have been able to design and develop new means and methods of warfare. And considering the advancement of technology, we had the will, power, and knowledge to create a new environment, cyberspace. But this environment also gives us the opportunity in defining and creating new means, cyber capabilities or cyber means that can be used as cyber means of warfare. And those events that we are continuously faced with, they represent for us a surprise. This is the reaction of leaders of our world when this kind of cyber operations or cyber incidents occur. Are we ready? Are we prepared for this reality? Unfortunately, we are not, and we have to do something about that. We are addressing our framework to decision makers, military people, and academia, and we have practically tried to first begin, like I said, with a model that designs the context of use of cyber weapons, that starts from the idea that an actor wants to achieve objectives, military objectives or non-military objectives, and for that has to employ cyber weapons by designing, implementing, and using them to achieve desired effects. But when that is done, it should be taken into consideration that you don't only achieve your military objectives and you get a military advantage, but you should also consider the collateral damage regarding civilian people or civilian objectives. So before engaging into an attack, we should be able to assess and predict those types of effects from both military and civilian perspective. Those targets, they are general entities. They can either be persons or objects, and they will be engaged into attack by using cyber weapons. And practically, from this model, the context of use model, what we should be able to use the most is the component, the action component, because in this component, which is practically the life cycle of a cyber weapon, we can see that cyber weapon, it first begins as an idea, as a concept. You want to achieve your objectives, your military objectives, and then you are thinking what kind of target, which would be the best target that you could select, and you would engage into attack in order to achieve your desired objectives. So you go into a reconnaissance phase. Based on that, when you have enough information, enough data collected about your target, you are able to design the cyber weapon. And that will be used by defining several functionalities or splitting your big objective in small objectives that will be in the next phase developed by using maybe programming or programming languages or scripting languages, by using diagrams and models that also will allow you to design and implement use cases as a basis for test cases that will be proposed and evaluated in the next phase. And based on that, you will see if your mirror environment that you're testing will actually match with reality. If this is happening, then you are able to go into the next phase, intrusion and control, and you are able to implant your cyber weapon in the targeted system. If all goes well, the cyber weapon will be employed, and if needed, it will be maintained. It may be the case that this will happen by having physical access or remote access, but considering AI and machine learning methods and technologies, this practically should be done and is practically done and will be definitely done in the future by learning from experience and learning from behavior and reasoning. So we are talking about neural and fuzzy logic here. And a very important step, which is practically connected with a very important subject that we heard today, and not only today, actually the whole time at this conference, is attribution. And this is, I will point it here in the exploitation phase, because it is possible that actors will delete completely their traces from the targeted system. It is possible that they don't have the knowledge or resources to do this, but it may also be a case when those actors want to make a point that they were there inside the targeted system and they don't want to delete completely their traces. Considering practically the context of use and the life cycle of a cyber weapon, I will propose the following definition, and I will split to each component and explain how did we choose practically each of them. So it is first of all a computer program. It's based on programming languages and scripting languages. And it is created or used. It is created because you may begin from the design phase and then implemented, tested, evaluated, and employed in the targeted system. But you may also only use it in the idea of, for example, we have dark web, we can buy those cyber weapons or we can order them according to a targeted system. And they can either alter or damage. Why alter or damage? Because maybe it depends on our objectives. We may only want to influence, but we also may want to damage temporarily or permanently a system. And that system, it can have any nature, but the carrier that we can go inside that system and target it, it's always an ICT component. Without an ICT component, we won't be able to target that system. And of course, to achieve objectives against adversaries inside or outside cyberspace. Once we have seen the definition that we propose, I will continue by showing you a profiling mechanism that is formed by characteristics and classification criteria. Cyber weapons are always target specific. They always go to a specific target, they always go in order to achieve specific goals and objectives of an actor. They have practically a logic nature. They are intangible because they are defined at the logical layer or cyberspace. They're basically based on code, on instructions. Even if code has a physical representation in memory, they will practically be designed at the logical layer. So for the real physical world, they won't be able to be touched. They're based off data, knowledge, and information about the target. They are practically considered a cheaper alternative compared to, for example, nuclear weapons or chemical weapons or biological weapons because they bring less cost in lives and resources. They can be adjustable and configurable. You may want, in some configs, to point a specific target, and targets can also be changed. The system can change and can be adaptable. About no reuse, sometimes it depends. If you decide to take countermeasures, then maybe that cyber weapon won't be able to exploit the same vulnerabilities and won't be able to be used again. But it may be the case that an actor is not aware or the time frame is a bit, let's say, different than expected, and that cyber weapon is able to be used again against the same targeted system. And since they can produce physical damage, they are considered by scholars as being a violent act, as having a violent nature. As classification criteria, I will point here 4. We have actually more that we will use as indicators and metrics for our effects assessment in cyber operations. It is always the purpose. We practically talk a lot about defending ourselves, but we forget to talk about offending, because defense won't exist without offense. So practically, we consider cyber weapons as being offensive to attack an adversary, as being defensive to defend your system from an adversary, but also it may be the case when the same cyber weapon, because it is configurable, it can be used in both purposes, offensive and defensive, so it is practically a multi-purpose cyber weapon. About sophistication, it is an entire discussion. We can consider that cyber weapons are highly sophisticated or lowly sophisticated. Highly sophisticated when actors are able to invest resources and time in developing high intelligent and innovative cyber weapons. Or lowly sophisticated when maybe they don't have enough resources or engineers to design and develop them, or maybe are based on some open source platforms and resources that are still not completely based on the most advanced technologies. And I will point area of action, but I will do this by considering it together with area of influence. So our action is regarding a target. So that is the main point that we consider, but we shouldn't forget the environment where that target is situated. So we should also take together area of influence. We speak about area of action and area of influence. We are acting on something, on a target, but we are influencing that target and the environment around that target. And that can be at national or international, global level. Like I said, we evaluated our framework on 3 cyber weapons, and we have designed a profiling matrix that you can find it in our article. And we have also conducted an exploratory case study on Stuxnet, which I won't emphasize now since everyone knows about. And I'll go to conclusion. Philosopher Erich Hofer said that the only way to predict the future is to have the power to shape the future. But how are we able to shape that future, since we are not practically able to understand and deal with things and events that happen in the present? It is a good question, and practically we should first change our mindset, and we should think more hybrid and realize that the future means quantum, that the future means a mix of intelligent systems, a hybrid intelligent systems future, and that in order to predict the future, we have to be able to dare the future, to be able to accept and understand the challenges of the future. Thank you. If you have any questions, please.
Actually, I have a question. This is on. So when I was looking at this, you described military objectives. Using cyber weapons only achieve military objectives. I'm curious why you put that as a scope condition on your definition. Because in some ways, you can use a weapon in the traditional sense to also disrupt and to destroy to achieve perhaps economic objectives. I'm curious why you wanted it here.
Actually, we don't eliminate it because in the definition, we put in the parenthesis military. So it can also be non-military. It can be a cyber operation. I mean, it's as a military operation, but it can be just a cyber activity. So just a group of people that are not involved in the military, that they don't work for a government, or just they want to achieve their objectives. So we don't only focus on the military. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh.
You're Charlie Statlander from the Army Cyber Command. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about perishability versus durability of cyber weapons. How much of a restart do you need to do if a weapon is completely burned or completely perished because its operations are known?
Could you maybe say again? Could you maybe repeat the question, or exactly which component should I face?
So how perishable or how durable are cyber weapons?
Thank you for the question. I believe it depends on the target. It depends on the environment of that target, and it also depends on your objectives. And also it depends on that, maybe that cyber weapon, it can be reconfigured or reused. So practically there are more indicators that we can take into consideration to think of that.
Yes. Hi, my name is Abidat. I'm from George Mason University. I have a quick question. Like you were talking about cyber weapons. The question is that would you have a cyber weapon which is not an information system, or we can safely say that every cyber weapon is actually a type of information system? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think it is practically an information system. It's based on information. It's based on ICT systems and technologies. probably in the future we can think maybe not of a cyber weapon, of a hybrid weapon that maybe combines cyber weapons with influence weapons and chemical weapons. I believe that will come, a hybrid weapon or a quantum weapon, but it will still be strongly interconnected to the idea of cyber weapon. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, Kim Nguyen, Blue Venture Investors. Based upon the cyber attacks that you discussed, Stuxnet and the one in Ukraine and Israel, can you comment a little about the capabilities of certain nation states? Are they more capable in certain types of operations than others?
I think that in the last decades we could have said that the state actors are more capable since they have access to better maybe specialists of engineers and resources, or they are able to buy let's say more expensive capabilities, but I think that in the present and in the future, this difference between state actors and non-state actors, from a technological perspective, will be less. Probably in a few years won't be any difference. We will all be able to do the same thing. I think that's the future practically.
Time for one more. Go ahead. Let's wait for the mic.
Okay, thank you. Excuse me, I'm just asking, is that time to speak about massive destruction weapon? Is that the cyber weapon is considered like a massive destruction weapon? And is it necessary to call for a treaty for non-proliferation of cyber weapon?
Thank you for the question. I think that we can maybe talk also as, about the cyber weapon as a weapon of mass destruction, and definitely we need regulations, laws and regulations for that. It depends on the damage, on the physical damage, but also let's not stay only with physical damage. So it is possible to put completely down a country or maybe a continent only by using a cyber weapon. I hope that won't happen, but that's possible. To have maybe the same amount of damage proportional with a physical damage done by another weapon of mass destruction. Thank you.
Following extensive operational experience in the Finnish Defense Forces, our third speaker became a teacher and researcher at the Finnish National Defense University, as well as a researcher at the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence. He currently is appointed to the Finnish Defense Command as a cyber defense planner. Please join me in welcoming Major Harry Kantola.
Thank you for the introduction and to choosing me to speak over here. I was yesterday looking at or listening to the keynote speakers and starting out with Mr. Shaw Henry talking about information sharing. Okay, this is good. You can keep on. Yeah. About information sharing, I was thinking, okay, what does this give? It's good that he takes this up because it's about what I'm going to talk about, information sharing in a federated network. And then I listened to Keith Alexander, and he took it also up as a big issue. So I'm glad that this is a hot topic. Basically, the issue that I'm talking about is an offspring to another research I did with my co-author. It was a reflexive control in a Russian perspective. And we got to think about what does this mean from a defensive point. If you're interested in the reflexive control paper, it will be hopefully published in the Journal of Information Warfare that Armstead is editing in. But so this is an offspring from that study. As said, this is my co-author's thoughts about the issues, not the Finnish Defense, National Defense Universities or my current employer. When I was listening to Sean and Keith Alexander, and in the afternoon also Mark and Anderson talking about information sharing and automated information sharing, I was like, okay, a presentation is gone. Sean, can I sit down now? Okay, sorry. But the thing is, what they talked about, yes, they talked about the importance of information sharing from their point of view in an own network. They also talked about information. They talked about indication of compromises and the technical aspect. They said, yes, Mark Anderson said, yes, you have to automate this. Yes, you can automate when you're talking from a technical perspective. The issue is that I don't think that that is enough. Especially when you think about information sharing and you're defending your own network. There's an additional issue when you talk about a federated network. And one example of a federated network you can see over there, and what they talked about is one of the clusters, how you defend that, and you share information. But when you want to defend the whole federation of networks, then you have other aspects that you need to take in considerations. From that point of view, we started to look into what can you do in a federation. Information sharing. Like Sean Henry said, this can be one part of the deterrence. It used to be that, no, you're not going to share your information because you reveal your ability to protect them. So that was deterring, okay, if I don't share, I know what I protect, and not sharing. And this is linked to the question to the previous speaker, that was, can you reuse the same weapon if you don't share the information? Why couldn't you use? Because if you look at the network, you can use the same weapon from another point of view into the federation. Not maybe to the same network cluster anymore, but to the rest of the network. So you have had one point of view that, no, you're not going to share the information. But then you have also studies that say, yes, you should share technical information. And for that reason, when they came up with, especially with what Libik said, yes, you need to share technical information, you have already created a lot of technology platforms, how you can share information, how automated can share information on a technical perspective. Because all these platforms that have there, they are formatted to change technical information in a standard format. The second issue that when we did the research, we realized, okay, yeah, some of the leadership says, yes, maybe we should share information, thinking about that. The middle layer, especially in a military environment, no, we are not going to share, because then we reveal how we defend our network, what kind of TTPs we have, techniques, tactics, and procedures we have. We are not going to reveal that. And then you talk to the technicians and the techie people. Don't tell anybody, but we are sharing this information already. I had the opportunity to talk with some bank specialists working in the banking sector, and they were saying, no, don't tell it. We have to share this kind of information to be able to protect, to know what is going on. So on a technical level, you already share information, but is that enough? We looked at this issue from a couple of different points of view in a federated network. And the easiest way to start thinking was, if you have an attack on your network from an adversary straight on. That's a basic normal situation, and that's what we had talked about yesterday, sharing information. Okay, you have been attacked, you have mitigated that, you know what the adversary did, you know what you did. Do you need to share information to the rest of the federation? Maybe you should, because like the question was, the attack could come into the network, to the federated network from another point of view, or other route. So you should basically share information about how the attack was conducted, what kind of procedures the attacker were using. And this information is not just technical. That is already an analysis of what is going on. So sharing, in addition to sharing the technical information, you should share a little bit more information than just the technical aspects, IPs from where it came. How it came, what it used. You don't need to share how you mitigate it. You don't need to share where it came into your network and what it did there, but information about the attacker. So that is the easy part, and that is what I think that Mr. Charles Henry and Keith Alexander and Mr. Anderson yesterday referred to. This kind of information you can share, you should share, but that's still on a technical level. A second thought that we said, okay, if you're attacked through the network, through the federated network, and you want to counter that, okay, you can go back and defend your network by going after the attacker, hackbacks, weaponized HANA tokens, etc., and address the adversary either to the same route that he came in or some other route. That doesn't matter, but you're skipping over the rest of the network and going straight forward to the attacker. Basically, you could do the same thing. You don't need to share information with the rest of the federated networks, your partners, but would it be good? That's the question. Because you're doing your mitigations and you try to end the attack. So here again, maybe it should be that you're telling the rest of the group how you're going to do it, especially if you're going to do it through your partner. Because there you might have that the partner that are defending his portion of the federated network don't see the actual attacker, but sees you when you're trying to defend and mitigate you instead of the attacker. So there might be some ideas to share information, especially if you're going to utilize the federated network to protect your portion of the network. So there again, we saw several issues that you need to share information with in addition to how the attacker is going to do, also what you are going to do within the federated network. The third issue was that we realized that maybe you cannot reach the attacker itself. You have to stop it in the federated network. Then you have still the same problems that in the previous case, that you need to stop it or do it in the federated network, and that would be, again, that you're in some portions of the network that doesn't belong to you. Somebody else is taking care of the protection. Don't see the attacker, but sees you again. So there are several places where you could do mitigation, stop the attack going on, defend your portion of the network, but you need to have the rest of the network protected. These are the issues that we looked through, and we looked what is there already, and we saw that there is studies from Sayer and White that have already talked about, in a technical perspective, they have established threat levels and just suggested incident information sharing entities to do related to these threat levels. The issue is that this, once again, there are technical issues that they want to say, indication of compromises and technical aspects that they want that you share. And if you want to defend a network, yes, you have these parts there that you need to take care of, but you also need to tell them how you're going to mitigate, how you're going to defend your portion. Are you going to use only within your framework, or do you need your partner to take part in that defense also? And, like I said, if you have been hit, if there is an adversary that is persistent, that he really wants to get into the federation, then he will find another route. And if the other ones in your the partners in the network don't know about how this adversary is going on, they will be less. They will have less possibilities to defend that. It would be good that if they had the information already, how they are proceeding, how they are coming, what kind of weapons they are using, because probably they would use the same kind of weapons from through another portion of the network. Why do I think this is important? In addition to the civilian world, for example, the banking sector, they have federated networks, they are doing already this, they have the networks connected. But the military is also doing, right now, building up for missions in Europe, federated mission networking, what you call in the US mission partner environment, MPE. So this is exactly what you're building up for missions in the military perspective. But this same kind of issues is going on also on the civilian side. You have networks that you are connected to other ones. And therefore I think this is important that you start thinking about the sharing. What we came up with, the conclusions were a long set. It's not meant for you to be read. A long set of categories and set of issues that you should be, minimum set of issues that you should share with your partners if you want to strengthen and create some deterrence in the federated network. So you can read it from the paper, but that was the issue. Sven Sarko talked about trust, and this was also an offspring in the study that we found out that you need to have a trust building issue in the federated network. In addition that you share technical information, cognitive information, or analyzed information about what is going on between the partners, you need to build a trust. And this is one attitude change that you need to do when you have a federated network. The problem is that you are sharing information. You're sharing your sensor information, you're sharing possibly sensitive information between your partners in the network. But if you don't share how to defend the federated network, you will just create new vectors, what the way the adversary can come into and get that information. If it's not through you, it must be through your partner. What a risk appetite. Thank you. This one. Okay.
John Cover. Quick question. Let's say now we follow your argument with Abai. That trust, we get the federated networks and so on. Then we flip it. And it's like a big invitation to use an attack on the federated network to crack trust between the partners. Mm-hmm. That would have other operational implications. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's exactly what I think it would be. If you look at the Afghan mission network that is already there, if somebody gets compromised there, they're kicked out from the network. That has a huge impact on the mission itself. If US get in Afghanistan, if they get compromised, they're kicked out. Okay, that means that medical resources are gone, US support for the rest of the mission is gone for their partners. Likewise, if Finland is there, okay, it's a small country, who cares if they're out, but that has impact if you have that. What I foresee, what the federated mission networking and the MPE project is going on with the federated networking. The idea is not to kick out, but to everybody to have possibilities to mitigate within the network use of experts, share the expert information to deal with that problem and not be kicked out. Instead, you work that, and there you have. If you don't share the information on defense, you will lose trust, and then you have the only way to use that is going back to the procedures that you have now. Kick them out, let them fix the network, come back when you're fixed. And that is not something that is foreseeable or desirable issue. What if it's a bank? You cannot say, okay, this bank has to go out from the network. You're not going to share banking information with you. So it's not just the military that has this problem.
Fernando, I'm unclear about what your thesis is. So we have protocols that are international in nature, and we have a variety of those. And we have also exchanges, such as the financial services ISAC, that happen at least in the U.S. and I know that there are analogs internationally. So, what are you advocating for new protocols, or are you advocating for new exchanges that are specific to military coalitions?
Basically, I'm advocating for extension of the existing protocols. The problem with the protocols that we have currently in place, they are mainly from a technical perspective, sharing technical information, and that will not be enough in the future when you have the structure changing in the federated network. Those are good. The existing protocols are good for protecting your own network, while you're not sharing information about what has been going on, how the attacker is doing, what the analysis is for that. So that is something that you don't share today. You share the technical information, but not what the analysis of what's going on. So you need an extension to the existing. Some of the protocols that you have enables cognitive information. Those are not, to my knowledge, that well utilized yet. But that's what you should do, to use the cognitive portions of those protocols in addition to the technical information shared.
Thank you.
Our final speaker today is a summa cum laude graduate of Harvard College, where her thesis on the People's Liberation Army's strategic thinking on information warfare was awarded the James Gord Bennett Prize. She is interned at the Department of Defense, FireEye, and the Carnegie Shinhwa Center for Global Policy, and worked as a research assistant at Harvard's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, as well as the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard. Currently, she's an analyst at the Long-Term Strategy Group. Let's welcome Elsa Kania.
Good morning. Thank you for the introduction. My research has focused on evaluating the divergences between U.S. and Chinese strategic thinking on the concept of cyber deterrence. Today I'll start with a generalized consideration of cyber deterrence, and then review my rationale for comparing U.S. and Chinese strategic thinking on the subject. After evaluating the critical aspects of U.S. and Chinese approaches, I will then assess the apparent asymmetries between their strategies and the resulting implications for strategic stability. At the most essential level, cyber deterrence, like deterrence in general, is a state of mind, actualized through the perceptions and calculations of a potential adversary. In this regard, the challenge of deterrence is specific to the threat actor in question and does not occur automatically as a result of offensive cyber capabilities. The underlying question is always to deter whom from what. The question of how to deter various forms of cyber attacks at various thresholds. And you can also look at cyber deterrence in terms of the utilization of cyber means to enhance strategic deterrence. Why focus on asymmetries? Not unlike the notion of international anarchy, how the constructivist scholar went, the concept of cyber deterrence is and will remain what states make of it, especially given the newness of the domain and the associated uncertainties. That is, U.S. and Chinese perspectives on cyber deterrence will influence their respective attempts to deter cyber threats and employ cyber capabilities for deterrent purposes. regardless of whether their evolving thinking on the concept is logically consistent or proves feasibly operational. Therefore, I would argue that it's critical to understand US and Chinese conceptualizations of cyber deterrence, especially the divergences in their respective strategic thinking and the implications for long-term strategic stability. I'll talk more briefly about cyber deterrence in US strategy, since that's presumably a topic with which this audience is generally more familiar. But in essence, official US cyber strategies have entailed declaratory policy for response to various forms of hostile acts in cyberspace through all necessary means, potentially including kinetic means, as reflected in the various 2011 and 2015 US cyber strategies. There's an emphasis on various forms of cost imposition, on denial, and on resilience, and increasingly also on norm formation. Although debated and quite debatable, the traditional analogies to nuclear deterrence often do seem to influence US discourse on cyber deterrence, even though the analogy, for various reasons, isn't quite a fully appropriate fit. However, in theory and in practice, cyber deterrence is recognized as uniquely challenging due to a number of factors, including the pervasive ambiguity of the domain, the diffusion of cyber power to myriad state and non-state actors, and the complexities of attribution. Arguably, a strategic deterrence of a cyber Pearl Harbor type scenario has been successful so far, but the deterrence of low-level cyber threat activities, for instance, those occurring below the threshold or in the gray zone, has proven difficult, if not entirely infeasible. Arguably, this raises the question of whether deterrence is even the appropriate framework to use in the cyber domain, especially when we're talking about activities such as espionage and intellectual property theft that haven't proven readily deterrable in more conventional contexts. Now, with regard to Chinese thinking on cyber deterrence, this is a challenging topic to look at, given that the available information is limited and transparency is quite lacking on the Chinese side. The People's Liberation Army has never published an official cyber strategy, and only last year officially acknowledged that it's developing cyber capabilities and cyber forces. Therefore, my analysis has been informed by the review of available writings associated with authoritative institutions and individuals from the People's Liberation Army, which allows for at least an approximate assessment of the contours of Chinese strategic thinking on cyber deterrence. For instance, the text of the Science of Military Strategy, published by the PLA's Academy of Military Science, which serves as a think tank advising the Chinese military's Central Military Commission, and is also involved in the formulation of official Chinese strategy and doctrine, as well as authoritative theorists associated with that institution and the journals that they commonly publish in. First, I'd like to highlight a couple of distinctive aspects of Chinese conceptualizations of cyber deterrence. First, the notion of cyber. In Chinese, Wangluo is literally network, and it conceptualized within the broader framework of information warfare, which also incorporates electronic warfare and psychological warfare. Earlier PLA texts, dating back to the late 90s and early 2000s, addressed the concept of information deterrence, which was intended to subdue the enemy without fighting and achieve victory through confrontation without bloodshed. The Chinese conceptualization of deterrence, Weishe, is also distinctive from typical Western frameworks, given that it seemingly includes aspects of compellence or coercive diplomacy. The term seemingly encompasses not only preventing or dissuading an adversary from undertaking a certain course of action, but also compelling the enemy to submit to one's volition or undo a course of action already taken. This may include using war to prevent war, as one of the typical phrases goes, not only containing the outbreak of a conflict, but also preventing the escalation of hostilities that have already started. The PLA's approach to deterrence also typically incorporates the principle of integrated deterrence and warfighting. For instance, this implies that information deterrence or cyber deterrence and actual combat could be carried out simultaneously. So to provide one basic, relatively authoritative PLA definition of cyber deterrence, this one from the 2013 Science and Military Strategy discusses it as involving, through demonstrating cyber attack and defense operational capabilities and establishing the firm resolution to retaliate, force the other side not to dare to undertake a large-scale cyber attack to avoid behavior that leads to serious consequences. In the Chinese understanding of it, cyber deterrence can involve cyber and conventional military capabilities, inherently a cross-domain concept. However, even this relatively authoritative text did admit that in Chinese thinking on cyber deterrence at that time, there were still very large differences of opinion, and its theories and practices were pending further development. So there continues to be a degree of uncertainty about these concepts and how to approach cyber deterrence in theory and in practice. To introduce a couple of recent and influential, though perhaps less authoritative, Chinese perspectives on cyber deterrence, two scholars from the PLA's Academy of Military Science, its Operational Theory and Doctrine Research Center, which again is involved in the formulation of official Chinese strategy and doctrine, have recently provided two relatively different perspectives on cyber deterrence. Notably, one relatively junior theorist has argued for engaging in three forms of deterrence by appearance, which involves, for instance, tests of cyber technology, displays of cyber armaments, and cyber combat exercises, and also a fourth form of warfighting deterrence through cyber combat operations, which could involve preventative or retaliatory attacks on an enemy's defense networks and even critical infrastructure systems. A more senior scholar at AMS, his work reflects that, to some extent, the PLA's approach to cyber deterrence is also influenced by its study of US cyber strategy, which has apparently contributed to a closer consideration of the options for the employment of additional instruments of national power to deter cyber threats. For instance, this influential theorist has called for the PLA to strengthen its cyber deterrence forces through utilizing national defense, legal, and moral forces. For instance, this could include attempted naming and shaming, analogous to the impact of Mandion's APT-1 report, which exposed Unit 61398 of the former 3rd Department of the PLA's General Staff Department. In fact, a Chinese cybersecurity company, G360, has since released several reports exposing cyber threat groups targeting China that it has described as advanced persistent threats. In that regard, utilizing a term initially used to refer primarily to Chinese cyber threat groups. Now, to turn to broader Chinese thinking on cyber deterrence within the framework of its approach to integrated strategic deterrence, the PLA has recognized and emphasized the potential contributions of cyber capabilities within its overall, highly integrated approach to strategic level deterrence. As some texts have emphasized, certain new forms of deterrence are expected to have revolutionary impacts on traditional deterrence, including various forms of blinding, paralyzing, and chaos-inducing methods in the cyber domain, space, and other domains, which, I quote, probably possess even more ideal deterrence outcomes. The PLA's new strategic support force, in fact, integrates cyber, space, and electronic warfare capabilities, as well as assorted new type forces, perhaps enabling enhanced strategic deterrence going forward. Based on this review of US and Chinese thinking on cyber deterrence, there are a couple of potential asymmetries that emerge between their approaches. First, at the conceptual level, the PLA is distinctive in its highly integrated approach to the information domain and information operations, as well as the intense focus on the perceptual and psychological dimensions of deterrence. At the organizational level, the PLA has continued to progress towards the integration of cyber, electronic, and space warfare capabilities, as well as political warfare forces and other new type capabilities through the Strategic Support Force. Now, potential asymmetries between US and Chinese strategies, again, based on the available information and open source texts, suggest that the PLA could use cyberspace or could use cyber operations distinctively given its conceptualization of reconnaissance or espionage, offense and defense as integrated. In addition, the PLA generally perceives cyber conflict in terms of the notion of cyber military struggle, which occurs continuously through peacetime and wartime. There is a related emphasis on the integration of peacetime and wartime. For instance, peacetime cyber preparation of the battlefield and continuous readiness, as well as the integration of military and civilian capabilities. For instance, the mobilization of cyber militias and various forms of civilian cyber forces. Although it's difficult to interpret how the PLA might approach nascent normative and legal constraints in a potential conflict scenario, it appears that PLA strategists do in fact anticipate attacks on civilian targets, including critical infrastructure, such as the power grid or telecommunications network. In addition, the PLA's ability and willingness to utilize various forms of plausibly deniable proxies and rapidly mobilize civilian forces could enable more deniable cyber operations in gray zone type setting. Now, to look briefly at the potential implications of these two very different approaches to cyber deterrence for strategic stability, given the PLA's concept of integrated deterrence in warfighting, it might seek to prevent escalation in a crisis or conflict scenario, for instance involving Taiwan, the South China Sea, through coercive retaliation signaling, which might involve information or cyber attacks. This could, even if it were intended by the PLA as an attempt to prevent escalation, it could very readily be misinterpreted as a prelude to kinetic escalation. The dynamics of cyber deterrence, which in practice inherently tends to be cross-domain and linked to broader frameworks of strategic deterrence, will never occur automatically in this bilateral context as a function of superior offensive capabilities or a perceived balance of threats, given that the cyber balance, so to speak, is inherently in flux, given the transient nature of capabilities and the fact that the efficacy of cyber weapons may often depend on the vulnerability of an adversary system. Therefore, this makes dynamics in this domain even more subject to misperception. So for a couple of concluding points, I've argued that based on differences in their strategic cultures and the prevailing organizational dynamics, the US and Chinese militaries have developed quite distinctive approaches to various aspects of information and cyber strategy, including cyber deterrence. Cyber deterrence itself requires understanding the mentalities and perceptions of a potential adversary. Certain aspects of the PLA's information or cyber warfare strategy, for instance, its emphasis on various forms of integration, the utilization of proxies, the potential lack of discrimination in targeting, could enable highly effective deterrence and contribute to China's national cyber power. Troublingly, the potential for various forms of misperception, especially given these differences in US and Chinese strategic frameworks, could contribute to the failure of deterrence or even exacerbate the risks of escalation in practice. And also concerningly, the PLA, as well as perhaps the US military, don't appear to have really fully evaluated and thought through these potential risks and issues of cyber crisis management. Ultimately, deterrence and avoidance of these forms of misperceptions will come down to communication and signaling, as well as nuanced understandings of each other's cyber strategies and the underlying differences in strategic culture. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Phil Ash, National Defense University. Lubicki just wrote a book not too long ago on cyber deterrence and cyber war, and some recent RAND studies indicate that to use the word deterrence in and of itself is very dangerous. And I wonder what your thoughts were based on literally your last point. Don't you think if we start to bend things, which we have a habit to do because we like to make the complex simple and think we can engineer a solution in complex, we can engineer a solution in complicated but not complex. So in saying that there is a deterrence option, aren't we actually lending this to a situation that can end up very Cuban Missile Crisis if we're not careful?
I agree that the application of the concept of deterrence to the cyber domain can be problematic from a number of dimensions, including because, unlike in a nuclear conventional context, you could argue that, consistent with the Chinese concept of cyber military struggle, there always are hostilities ongoing, and it's more of a matter of preventing their escalation than preventing the usage of quote-unquote cyber weapons. I approach this from the perspective of trying to understand US and Chinese perspectives on cyber deterrence. But I agree that based on my research, it does seem that certain aspects of this concept when applied could be problematic and could exacerbate some of the tensions in this domain.
Hello, I'm Matt Wilcox from the University of Georgia. I had a question. You mentioned China might use cyber in a cross-domain response, in response to something else in a crisis. Could you see that going the other way?
I think that certainly the cyber domain, the interactivity between the cyber domain and tensions in a conventional context is problematic, and it's hard to know how this might play out in a crisis scenario. I do think that China sees the use of cyber capabilities as effective for coercion, and so I think looking forward, the interactivities could result in a variety of cross-domain effects and operations, and I think we need to think carefully about how these dynamics will play out, especially when there are a variety of conventional crises and tensions, including the South China Sea and Taiwan, where there could be spillover between domains.
Ma'am, thank you for your presentation. I thought it was really informative. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. My name is Mike, by the way. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on attribution as it relates to cyber deterrence, and then as a tangential point to that, do you believe, sort of as a result of some of the attribution issues, that cyber deterrence is less possible, whereas cyber being utilized as a deterrent is more possible? If that made sense to you.
Yeah, I think that certainly attribution can be a complicating and a contributing factor to deterrence. For instance, from a Chinese perspective, the Manding report, the exposure of 3 PLA hackers and their subsequent indictment did have a deterrent effect to a certain extent. Though I think that Chinese use of proxies does result in complexities. I think attribution is also a subjective, politically constructed dynamic. That is, even if you can, for instance, in the case of the OPM attack, the Chinese government later claimed that cyber criminals were responsible and supposedly arrested some hackers who may have had presumably had little involvement in OPM itself, or might have only been in trouble for getting caught. And so I would say that Chinese use of proxies complicates attribution, because even if you can determine who these cyber actors are, hard to prove who specifically has ordered them or what command and control they're under. And I think the flip side of that is that when you do have more effective attribution, it can serve as a deterrent, or can contribute to resulting in more accountability in this domain. I think the flip side of that is you can now see China attempting to develop its own attribution capabilities and seeking to name and shame various foreign forces who it sees engaging in hacks against itself. So I think that, arguably, given that attribution is such a contested and fraught, it can be such a contested and fraught issue. If there were some sort of international mechanism for more objective attribution, that could contribute to better credibility. But certainly it, I think, will continue to be a major factor in terms of how both sides approach this domain and the strategic issues.
Thank you. I'm Shar, and I enjoyed your presentation very much. Thank you. Regarding the question from the gentleman from Georgia, I believe, about the use of kinetic and cyber together, I actually did a study on that, and China was included in that study. And to the deterrence question, just an observation here. In some cases, they followed a kinetic event with their cyber event, and in other cases, particularly in the areas of espionage, they led with cyber. Just wanted to share that.
Thank you. I think there are, as I said, a lot of interactivities between the kinetic and the cyber domain, and potential for spillover between the two in many cases.
Hello, ma'am. Cadet Miranda Bass from West Point. In relation to the captain's question, are there Chinese cyber actors who are actually independent of the PLA or of the party? And if so, how much, if they are independent, how much influence does the party have over them?
That's a very good question, and a difficult one to answer based on the information available to me. I approach this mostly through looking at essentially textbooks and other writings the PLA has on the topic. I think certainly given the amount of control that the Communist Party and People's Liberation Army exercise, it would assume that relatively few cyber actors are wholly independent or are acting with, at the very least, their tacit or implicit support. I mean, certainly the PLA textbooks have discussed various forms of civilian cyber forces, including those within government departments, private companies, or independent patriotic hackers who can be mobilized. I wouldn't say that every single one of their activities is necessarily under the direct command and control of the party, and issues of maintaining command and control of these various proxy forces have been a concern of Chinese writers in the literature. There also have been cases of various freelancing groups within the PLA and otherwise who have potentially in relation to various forms of corruption been engaged in profit-making activities that the PLA might now be trying to rein in as it consolidates control of its cyber forces under the Strategic Support Force. So, not a question that I have a very clear answer for, and I think the situation is murky, but certainly when Chinese government claims that independent hackers who are entirely outside of their control are responsible for something, I tend to approach that claim with a healthy degree of skepticism.
Thank you very much. I'm Lisa Post from the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Tallinn. And I particularly appreciated you explaining the very integrated approach to strategy as such that China takes and that the West and the Euro-Atlantic community often misunderstands with China as well as with Russia. But when I look at China on a quite a superficial level, all of their policy, defense or otherwise, seems to then feed into this desire to achieve economic superiority. So then it's not the defense end, but then there's an economic end. Could you comment some on how cyber fits into that framework and how it spills over from a military or defense use to more of an economic use? Thank you.
So certainly, as you mentioned, for China, a lot national power and its interests are often defined in very economic terms, and certainly there are plenty of examples of how PLA sought to use cyber forces for economic means, including theft of intellectual property. There's also a massive open source collection effort of technical intelligence. So certainly the PLA cyber forces have been engaged in intellectual property theft, but arguably it's starting to shift those responsibilities over from PLA forces to other contractors and trying to get its military cyber forces more focused on military functions. Though certainly China does see economic issues as the crux of its power, and it is often proven quite willing to use cyber capabilities in order to advance those ends.
Last question.
Hi, it's very interesting. Phil Stevens, a question I've been thinking a lot about over the course of the conference is how the calculus of counterforce versus countervalue is impacted by cyber. And it seems like you started to get to that, but I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Sure, this isn't something I've addressed specifically in my presentation, though I think certainly looking at a PLA thinking on targeting, there certainly do focus on one hand on attacking defense networks and going after the vulnerabilities inherent in US military power, communication systems, C4ISR more broadly. Chinese targeting also anticipates attacks on civilian targets, critical infrastructure, from telecommunications, power grid, and not entirely clear to me how this would play out beyond more theoretical writings on the subject in practice and in operational terms, though I think certainly the variance in constraints between what US cyber forces can and can't target, given our application of nascent frameworks from the laws of war and our more normative approach to cyber operations, and on the other hand, what Chinese cyber forces might in practice end up targeting, I think could impact deterrence, since there's certainly uncertainty about what restraints or they may or may not adhere to when they're going after counterforce or countervalue targets. And I think certainly they're targeting civilian targets introduces a potentially problematic dimension into that.
So just concluding, I think one thing that we saw today, those of you that actually study cyber conflict, you know it's somewhat at a nascent stage as we try to really wrestle with the strategic implications of operations in this domain. And I think you saw 4 scholars that took every part of this, from looking at cyber weaponry to advanced defenses to conceptualizations of power, which are fundamentally important for the understanding of cyber deterrence, and also the implications of how that can lead to instability in the cyber domain. At this moment, I'd like to take a minute just to thank our 4 panelists who provided some great papers that I really enjoyed reading.